My name is Emily Carter. I am 29 years old, and for as long as I can remember, I've imagined walking down the aisle in a gown that would make even the most cynical heart soften. But on my wedding day, my mother-in-law wore a wedding dress to my wedding and landed in a jet to steal the spotlight. If you were in my shoes, what will you do? Before I continue my story, kindly take a moment to subscribe to this YouTube channel, thank you. Now back to my story. Every detail of my wedding day was a carefully woven thread in a tapestry I'd been creating in my mind since I was a little girl. I'd chosen a venue tucked away in the rolling hills outside Portland, Oregon, a restored barn with string lights that draped like constellations over the dance floor. It wasn't grand in a royal way, but it had a warm intimacy, the kind that made you feel like you belonged there the moment you stepped in. The morning air was brisk but pleasant. The scent of lavender from the garden floated through the open windows of the bridal suite. Hannah, my maid of honor, was bustling around in her champagne silk dress, making sure every makeup brush and curling iron was in its place. She had a way of making chaos feel organized, a trait I adored in her. I stood in front of the mirror, my ivory satin gown hugging me like a second skin, its lace sleeves delicately brushing my wrists. My mother, Margaret, sat nearby, her hands clasped together as if in prayer. "You look like a dream, Emily," she said softly, and her voice carried a weight of emotion I didn't dare disrupt with words. Nathan, my soon-to-be husband, had always been the calm to my whirlwind. In the weeks leading up to the wedding, he'd told me over and over that no matter what happened that day, we'd end it as husband and wife, and that was all that mattered. Till I wanted the picture-perfect wedding, the kind you frame and keep on your mantle for generations. The guests began arriving just after noon, the rustle of dresses and the click of polished shoes filling the space. I peeked out from the upstairs window and caught sight of my father, Richard, greeting old friends with his booming laugh. Beyond him, the autumn trees swayed gently, their golden leaves catching the sun like flecks of fire. Hannah adjusted my veil and whispered, "This is it, Em. All those Pinterest boards, all the planning, it's all come together." I smiled, my chest swelling with gratitude. The musicians tuned their instruments outside, and the faint notes of a cello drifted in, wrapping around my nerves and soothing them. I could hear laughter, the clinking of glasses, and the occasional squeal of someone seeing an old friend. It was the kind of joyful noise I wanted to bottle up and keep forever. I thought about Victoria, my future mother-in-law. We had a complicated relationship, polite but strained. She carried herself with an air of sophistication that sometimes felt like quiet judgment. Nathan assured me she liked me, but I'd never been entirely convinced. Till I'd made a point to include her in the planning, sending her updates and asking for her input on the menu. She declined most offers, saying she trusted my vision. I took it as a good sign. The ceremony was set to begin in 20 minutes. Hannah handed me my bouquet, soft blush roses with sprigs of eucalyptus, and I inhaled the fresh scent, grounding myself in the moment. Then, in the midst of my reverie, I heard it, a faint, growing hum in the distance. First, I thought it was just a passing plane, nothing unusual for the area. But it grew louder, deeper, like the sound of a storm rolling in far too quickly. Guests began to turn their heads toward the sky, some shielding their eyes from the glare of the sun. I didn't know it yet, but the day I'd dreamed of, the one I'd curated so carefully, was about to take a turn I could never have imagined. The hum became a roar, the kind that made conversations falter and heads tilt upward in unison. From my vantage point upstairs, I could see movement beyond the treetops, a sleek silver private jet cutting through the blue like a knife. It wasn't just flying overhead. It was circling. I froze, my bouquet clutched against my chest, as the jet dipped lower and began its descent toward the open field adjacent to the venue. The sound was deafening, the kind that vibrated in your ribcage and made the air itself feel heavy. Hannah stepped beside me, eyes wide. "Is that landing here?" she asked, her voice almost swallowed by the engine's thunder. The guests below had forgotten entirely about the cello music. Phones were raised, some recording, some snapping frantic pictures. I could see my father shading his eyes, his jaw slack. Nathan was out near the officiant, speaking with the best man when he turned toward the field. Even from here I could see the confusion on his face. The jet touched down in a slow, theatrical glide, the kind you see in movie montages of billionaires arriving in style. The wheels stirred up swirls of dust, and when it finally stopped, the engines wound down to an ominous silence. I leaned forward against the window, my stomach twisting. "Do you know who that is?" I asked Hannah. Her lips pressed into a thin line. "I have a guess, but I hope I'm wrong." The jet's door opened with a hiss, a metal staircase lowering gracefully to the grass. For a moment, nothing happened. Crowd was utterly still, save for the soft rustle of dresses in the wind. Then a figure emerged at the top of the steps, tall, poised, her blonde hair perfectly styled in soft waves that didn't dare move in the breeze. Victoria Brooks. She paused at the top, as if surveying her kingdom, then descended the stairs with a measured grace that made it feel less like a walk and more like a coronation. I stepped back from the window, my pulse hammering. "Oh my God," I breathed. "She flew in a jet? For my wedding?" Hannah glanced at me, her voice dry. "Not just for your wedding, Emily. Wait until you see what she's wearing." From the staircase's base, Victoria's outfit came into view fully, a floor-length pristine white gown with a fitted bodice and delicate beadwork that shimmered in the sunlight. Train trailed behind her like a ripple of silk water. It wasn't just white. It wasn't just formal. It was a wedding dress. My knees wobbled and Hannah grabbed my arm. "Steady," she whispered, though her own voice was shaking. Sighed, a murmur spread through the guests, rising like a tide. Some exchanged glances of disbelief, others outright stared, mouths open. My father looked from Victoria to the barn door where I stood hidden upstairs, his expression caught between confusion and outrage. Nathan took a hesitant step toward his mother, clearly blindsided. She greeted him with a kiss on the cheek and a warm smile, as though nothing about this was strange. She even waved at the guests, a queen acknowledging her loyal subjects. I wanted to march down the stairs and demand to know what on earth she was thinking, but my feet stayed rooted. My mind was a carousel of disbelief, embarrassment, and a growing heat of anger. "She's literally stealing the show," Hannah murmured. "People are forgetting you're even the bride." The field buzzed with energy now, the jet looming like a giant silver exclamation point behind the scene. Victoria chatted with a cluster of Nathan's relatives, who seemed equally enthralled and bewildered. The cameras, the ones I'd hired to document my perfect day, were pointed at her. Through the glass, I could see her throw her head back in a practiced laugh, her hand brushing down the gown's skirt as if to ensure it caught the light just right. I pressed my palm to the cool window pane, trying to steady my breathing. The music had stopped entirely now. My carefully timed procession was in shambles. And the woman who was supposed to be welcoming me into her family was outside making sure no one could look away from her. I'd imagined surprises at my wedding, maybe a funny speech, maybe a quirky dance from my college friends. But this felt like the first crack in the perfect day I dreamed of, and I had no idea how wide it would spread. I had seen many types of wedding day distractions in movies, ex-boyfriends showing up, rainstorms, the occasional forgotten ring, but nothing in my mind compared to watching my mother-in-law glide into my wedding in a gown that could have been taken straight from a couture bridal boutique. When I finally descended the stairs, Hannah at my side like a protective shadow, the hum of whispers grew sharper. Heads turned in waves, not toward me, but toward the vision of white already mingling with my guests. It was like stepping into someone else's wedding. Victoria turned when she heard the movement at the barn door. For a split second, her eyes swept over me, my dress, my veil, my bouquet, then back to the group she was entertaining, as if my entrance was merely incidental. "Nathan," I said quietly when I reached him, my voice low enough for only him to hear. "What is she wearing?" He rubbed the back of his neck, clearly as lost for words as I was. "Emily, I had no idea she was coming like this. She didn't tell me she was arriving by jet and definitely not in." His voice trailed off as his gaze dropped to the gown. "In that." Close, the details were even more striking. Intricate lace along the neckline, delicate pearl beads sewn into the train, and a fitted waist that looked tailor-made for her. It wasn't some vague white formal dress you could pass off as coincidence. No, this was undeniably a bride's gown, from the way the bodice hugged her to the way the skirt fanned with deliberate elegance. I stepped slightly to the side, hoping to catch her eye. She finally met my gaze and smiled. That kind of smile that said, "Isn't this just marvelous?" Without actually needing words. "Emily, darling, you look lovely," she said, her tone dripping with the kind of sweetness that always seemed to hide something sharper underneath. I thought it would be fun to really dress up for the occasion. After all, it's not every day your only son gets married. "Dress up," I echoed, forcing my voice to stay level. "Yes, well," she glanced down at herself, brushing her fingers lightly along the bodice as if admiring it anew. "I wanted something special, something that made a statement. And with all the photographers here, it just seemed fitting." I caught Hannah's quick, barely audible snort beside me. The officiant approached quietly, clearly unsure how to proceed. Guests were still buzzing, many trying to discreetly, or not so discreetly, take more photos of Victoria than of me. One of Nathan's aunts leaned in toward another guest and whispered, not quietly enough, "She looks like the bride herself." The words hit me like a slap, though the sting was softened by the fact that I'd already been thinking the exact same thing. As the ceremony was about to begin, Victoria took a seat in the front row, her gown spilling elegantly into the aisle like it had been placed there for a photo spread. The jet still gleamed in the background beyond the field, a silent reminder of her grand entrance. Walking down the aisle, I tried to hold on to Nathan's earlier reassurance that the most important thing was ending the day as husband and wife. But every time I caught sight of a guest glancing toward her instead of me, the ache in my chest deepened. I knew what the photos would look like. I knew how the stories would sound when guests went home. "You should have seen Victoria. She arrived in a jet in this incredible white gown. Oh, and yes, Emily looked nice too." When we exchanged vows, I forced myself to focus on Nathan's eyes, the steady warmth in his gaze. He was mine. The marriage was ours. But in the periphery of every moment there was that white gown, catching the light, refusing to be ignored. It was no longer just a dress. It was a message, deliberate, shimmering, and impossible to mistake. The moment the officiant pronounced us husband and wife, applause filled the air, but it wasn't the kind of unbroken wave I'd imagined. Somewhere within the clapping, there were murmurs and sidelong glances, as if people were still processing what they'd seen that day. Nathan kissed me, and for a few precious seconds I let myself sink into the moment. The sun was warm on my skin, my heart was pounding for all the right reasons, and I could hear my mother sniffling in the front row. But the spell cracked the instant I turned to walk back down the aisle and caught the unmistakable click of cameras pointed, not at us, but at Victoria. She stood as we passed, leaning forward slightly so her gown brushed into the aisle just enough to be in the frame. She beamed at me like this was the happiest day of her life, as though she were sending us off from her own ceremony. The reception, the shift became impossible to ignore. Guests swarmed her table before even greeting us. I could hear snippets as I passed. "That jet was incredible. Where did you get that dress? You look stunning." Tone was full of admiration, almost giddy, as if she had performed some sort of dazzling magic trick for everyone's entertainment. I sat at the head table beside Nathan, smiling through conversations with relatives while watching Victoria laugh with a group of guests near the bar. Every few minutes, someone would approach her for a selfie. The photographers, the ones I had hired specifically to capture my wedding, drifted toward her again and again, snapping photos like she was the celebrity in the room. Nathan noticed my gaze. "Emily," he said softly, "I know this isn't how you pictured it, but please don't let her take this day from you." His words were gentle, but they didn't quite reach the place inside me where the hurt had settled. 'Cause it wasn't just about the dress or the jet. It was about the way she had positioned herself, literally and figuratively, at the center of my wedding. When we cut the cake, she managed to appear just beside us, offering to help with the knife, her pearl-adorned wrist brushing mine in every picture. During our first dance, she glided onto the floor as soon as the music shifted to a livelier song, pulling Nathan into a spin that had the crowd cheering. It wasn't malicious in the way an obvious sabotage would be. It was subtle, like a performance so polished it could pass as genuine joy if you weren't looking closely. By the time the speeches began, I was exhausted from the effort of pretending. My father gave a heartfelt toast, my mother followed with sweet, teary words, and then, unplanned, Victoria stood. "I just want to say," she began, her voice carrying effortlessly across the room, "that seeing my son marry such a beautiful, accomplished woman today has been the highlight of my life. I wanted to arrive in a way that showed him just how special this day is, something grand, something unforgettable. And judging by the looks on your faces when that jet landed," she chuckled lightly, "I think I succeeded." The guests laughed and clapped, though a few exchanged looks that said they weren't entirely sure how to take her words. I sat frozen, my smile brittle, because the message was clear. This day was unforgettable because of me. After the toast, she received a standing ovation from some of Nathan's family. My father stayed seated. My mother's hand found mine under the table, squeezing it just once. Later, when the evening softened into warm lights and slow dances, I escaped to the back porch for air. From there, I could still hear the music, but it was muffled, distant. The sky had gone deep blue, and the fields stretched quietly under the glow of the moon. Nathan joined me after a few minutes. "You okay?" he asked, his voice careful. "I'm married to you," I said, managing a small smile. "That part's perfect." I hesitated. But I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel invisible at times today. He exhaled slowly. "I'm sorry, Em. I didn't think she'd... I don't even know what to call it." We stood there in silence for a while, listening to the muffled laughter and clinking glasses inside. I wanted to believe that years from now this would just be an odd anecdote, a strange, mildly amusing story about the day my mother-in-law wore a wedding dress and arrived in a jet. But standing there in the cool night air, I knew it had carved itself deeper than that. Because it wasn't just the spotlight moving away from me. It was the realization that some people don't just share moments, they consume them entirely. The next morning, the glow of the candles and fairy lights was replaced by the cold clarity of sunlight. Our honeymoon bags were packed by the door, but before we could leave, Nathan's parents invited us to brunch at their home. I was tempted to decline to avoid the risk of reliving the previous day's spectacle, but Nathan asked me gently, and I agreed. Victoria greeted us at the door as if nothing unusual had happened. She wore a crisp silk blouse and wide-legged trousers, her hair perfectly arranged. The wedding gown and the jet were nowhere in sight, but their presence still hung invisibly in the air. "Well, newlyweds," she said brightly, "how does it feel? Wasn't it a magical day?" "It was certainly memorable," I replied, keeping my tone even. Over omelets and coffee she regaled us, and anyone who would listen, with tales of her arrival. "You should have seen the faces when that jet landed," she said, laughing. "People will talk about that for years." She spoke about the dress too, brushing off any suggestion that it might have been inappropriate. "Oh, it's just a dress. Color is classic. I've always loved white, it flatters my skin tone." Nathan shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Mom, it wasn't just white. It was a wedding dress." She waved a hand, smiling indulgently. "Darling, you're overthinking. No one would confuse me for the bride." I swallowed my response, because saying what I truly felt would have ignited a fire neither of us was ready to put out. But inside the words boiled. They did confuse you for the bride. And that's exactly what you wanted. After brunch, we said our polite goodbyes and headed for the car. Once the door shut behind us, I exhaled as though I'd been holding my breath for hours. "She's not going to apologize," I said quietly. Nathan's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "I know. And I'm sorry for that." He paused. "I'll talk to her. But Emily, I think for her this wasn't about taking anything from you. It was about making sure she was remembered." I stared out the window as the landscape blurred by. She succeeded. On our honeymoon, the subject came up again and again. Not because I wanted it to, but because friends and relatives kept sending us texts and photos. "Your mother-in-law's entrance was legendary," one message read. Another came with a blurry video of the jet landing, captioned like something out of a movie. In each image, my wedding gown was there, but so was hers. Sometimes side by side in the same frame like two competing headlines. When we returned home, I found myself replaying moments from that day, looking for the cracks where the joy had leaked out. It was there in the way the photographer hesitated between taking my picture and hers. It was in the way guests told the jet story before they told the story of our vows. It was in the way my own memory had been smudged, replaced with a different centerpiece. Weeks later, I finally spoke to Victoria alone. I chose a quiet Sunday afternoon, inviting her for tea. She arrived with a bouquet of lilies, her smile as polished as ever. "I wanted to talk about the wedding," I began. "About your arrival. And your dress." Her eyes lit up. "Oh, did you love it?" I thought it was such a dramatic touch. I held her gaze. "It was dramatic. But it hurt me. It felt like you made the day about you." For the first time, her smile faltered. Not much, just a flicker. She didn't apologize, but she did tilt her head, as if seeing me differently for a moment. "Emily," she said finally, "I suppose I've always believed life is too short to be subtle. But I didn't mean to hurt you." It wasn't an admission of guilt, nor was it the apology I'd quietly hoped for. But it was something. As she left, I realized the memory would always be tangled, my joy braided with a thread of frustration I couldn't fully untangle. The photos would tell a story, but not the whole one. The whole story was in the quiet moments, the breath I had to steady before walking down the aisle, the way my bouquet felt heavier in my hands, the night air cooling my skin when I escaped the noise. Some days, I wish I could erase the jet and the dress from that memory entirely. But perhaps in time they'll fade into the background, and what will remain is the man I married, the vows we spoke, and the truth I learned. That even in the most important moments of your life, someone else may try to take the stage. And when they do, you have to decide whether to fight for the spotlight, or to let your own light be enough. It was months after the wedding when I realized I was still carrying her dress in my mind. Not physically, of course, but like a ghost that kept slipping into my thoughts uninvited. Every time I saw our wedding album, the sting would creep back, not as sharp as before, but enough to make me sigh. One rainy afternoon, I sat alone by the living room window, a cup of chamomile tea cooling in my hands. Nathan was at work, and the house was wrapped in a comfortable silence. Sighed, droplets slid down the glass, each one racing another, and I found myself thinking about the weight of resentment. How it doesn't just sit quietly, it builds, spreads, colors the way you see someone. The truth was, I didn't want to carry this forever. Not because what she did was harmless, it wasn't, but because keeping the wound open was exhausting. Every time I replayed it, I was giving the moment new life. And in doing so, I was letting it overshadow the joy that should be shining brightest. I remembered something my mother once told me: forgiveness isn't a gift you give someone else. It's a gift you give yourself so you can breathe again. So I made the decision, not to excuse her behavior, not to pretend it didn't happen, but to let go of the hold it had on me. I wouldn't flinch when someone mentioned the jet. I wouldn't grimace when her gown appeared in a photo. I would let it be what it was, a strange, audacious choice on a day that, despite everything, was still mine. A few days later, I called Victoria. We spoke about light things, the weather, a new recipe she'd tried, and then, without fanfare, I said, "I've decided I'm not holding on to any anger about the wedding anymore. It's in the past, and I'd like to keep it there." She paused, then said softly, "I'm glad to hear that, Emily." Whether it was relief, indifference, or something else entirely in her voice, I didn't analyze. I didn't need to. When I hung up, I felt lighter. The memory was still there, but it no longer had teeth. My wedding day was still imperfect, but it was mine again, because I'd finally chosen to take it back.